Okay. Also, our recorded lectures are also on YouTube. So same thing with today. I'll be uploading them after the meeting. Okay. So we finished with some simple dynamic oligopoly models, right? With Stackelberg price leadership. The next topic is related to dynamic games. Okay. So dynamic games are similar to those models in the sense that in this one, not everyone is acting at the same time. One is doing something first, which allows another firm to respond, or consumers to respond. And in particular, in dynamic games, industrial organization, yung pinagtutuan na natin dito is entry games. So, babalik tayo sa entry. Entry happens in the long run. So another way to think about these models is sort of a long run industry equilibrium, okay, where entry is allowed to happen. And yung punto ng mga models natin dito is to show if it's possible for firms to deter entry. So deterrence means to stop entry from happening. So my first question is this: why would a company want to deter entry? Based on what you already know, why would they want to deter entry? There's a chat. Again, you can use the mic, so just so it's a little quicker. Okay, right. If you exclude competition, then you have no competition or less competition, so you are able to increase your price and exercise more market power. Very easy. So, is that even possible? The answer is yes. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time in the rest of this class. We'll talk about other things. In particular, this is the outline for the full set of slides. Pero tayo, if I can draw here, we're not going to do any of this. Okay? We're just going to end with a simple model of entry deterrence. Okay? And the most important thing is introduce the concept of dynamic games and backward induction. Okay, so this is more of a technical game theory, very simple technical game theory, and we will end with a model of entry deterrence. So the reason why we're doing it is because the dynamic games here in entry in the game theory section really incorporate the essential insight. Okay, ano yung essential insight na yun? The insight is if you want to deter someone from entering, you have to do something pretty extreme. And you have to convince someone that what you're doing is something that you're committing to. Okay? And babalik tayo dun sa original model na ginawa natin last week, which is the Stackelberg, right? And in particular, if people are following their best response, it will be very difficult to commit to an action that will stop someone from entering. Normally in a Stackelberg. Kung naalala niyo yung Stackelberg, if I commit, for example, to producing the perfectly competitive output, I can actually deter you from entering. Okay? But that is very costly for me because that is not my best response. Okay. So that is why, so in future, like if we had a little bit more time, like another lecture meeting, we could talk about any of these things which can really delve into some more detailed industry oligopoly level models of predatory conduct and limit pricing. But having said that, dito muna tayo sa dynamic games, which totally incorporates yung credibility ng threat. So yun yung hahanapin mong lesson ngayon. Yung credibility ng threat, which will mean that entry will be deterred because the threat is credible. Okay. As opposed to what will happen last week, wherein you might think that it's not really that credible. So now let's talk about dynamic games, right? Nash equilibria. And here I repeat, pag sinabi natin dynamic games, we're really thinking here more of entry games, okay? Wherein the second player, the follower player, will decide whether they want to enter or produce some positive amount. So the timing is as follows. Player one chooses action A1, which is either like quantity or price, okay? It could also be, in other models, increase the capacity of your company, right? So there are different ways to do this game, but at this point, we will start with a generic A1 from a set of feasible actions, capital A1. So si player 2 observes one's choice, so of A1 of the set A, capital A1, then they'll chooses its own A2. And then after the players choose their actions, they receive the following payoffs, okay? Which you can think of here as profits. So these are profits, and these are profits. Generally, these are utilities, okay, which depend on everyone else's action. So utility of one or profit of one depends on its own, as well as everyone else. And the same thing with profit of two. So these are examples, which we studied the Stackelberg model already. So here's our new solution. As opposed to simple Nash equilibrium, we're looking at backward induction. In many dynamic games, there are many Nash equilibria, some of which depend on non-credible threats. So non-credible threats are threats that the threatener would not want to carry out, but will not have to carry out if the threat is believed. Backward induction identifies a Nash equilibrium that does not rely on such non-credible threats. So in other words, if there are equilibria which relies on non-credible threats, we exclude those from the set of equilibria that we are interested in and will likely to happen. So it involves working backwards using what's called an extensive form of the game. So ngayon, we will introduce the extensive form. So an extensive form is composed of, it's essentially something that looks like a network. It has branches, nodes, and payoffs. Okay. Vectors of payoffs in the sense that we already know, which is the one on the left is the payoff of the first layer, and the one on the right is the payoff of the second layer. So nodes is the decision points of the game. Kung kailan magdidesisyon ang each company or firm, right? So nodes are labeled depending on which firm makes the move at that position. Branches are drawn from a node representing the choice of actions at that node for each player. Each branch points to another node where further action takes place or to payoffs, which means that this particular node has ended the game kasi may payoffs. Tapos na yung game. At any node, players know about the course of play that has led to the node. Okay. Meaning, if you are at any particular node, I know the sequence of actions that has led us to this particular game. Here we have a particularly simple game, and this is essentially as complicated as it can be. Maybe a little bit more complicated, but this is it. So let's identify some of those things. Like these are the nodes, and these lines here are the branches. Okay. And each node is identified with a player. So in this node, si player 1 ang magde-decide, and in this node, si player 2 ang magde-decide. And in each node, there are branches which are labeled with actions: trust, not trust, player 2, betray, or on. And then at the end of player 2's node, these are the payoffs, which means the game ends after player 2 acts. In the usual sense, or the case before extensive games, we would show this as this game normal. I think this is called the normal form. Normal form. If this is the extensive form, then this is the normal form. So before we continue, we could come up with the Nash equilibrium for this one. Okay. Which again is if you want to play for each player, you try to get the best response for anything that the other player would do. So if player one, for example, plays trust, what is well, let's start with player one, right? Player two. If player two plays honor, what is player one's best response? So i-compare mo si one, which is player one's profit if he trusts. Oh, sorry. Let's delete that. And then player not zero if it's not trust. So 1 is bigger than 0. So actually, we underline natin. If player 2 plays betray, ano ang best move ni player 1? Player 1 would like to not trust. So dito siya. Similarly, if player 1 plays trust, what is player 2's best move? It would be this one. Okay. And if player 1 plays not trust, what is player 2's best move? It would be this one. So under this situation, we would have a not trust and betray as the Nash equilibrium. Okay. And here we just have the same picture again. So now let's think about this in a dynamic game form. Player 1 chooses to either to trust or not trust player 2. Player 2 chooses either to honor or betray one's trust. So let's think about the series of actions and the payoffs associated with them. If player 1 chooses not trust, then the game ends. Player 1 terminates the relationship. So if player 1 chooses not trust, then we're here. Then player 2 essentially also gets 0-0. Okay, so pareho silang not trust. Okay. If player 1 chooses trust, the game continues and 2 chooses to either honor or betray one's trust. So if player 1 trusts, then now we are here and player 2 will decide either to betray or to honor. If player 1 chooses to end, both players' payoffs are 0. Okay, that's to not trust. If player 1 chooses to trust, then both players' payoffs are 1 if 2 honors one's trust. Okay. So if 1 chooses to trust and then 2 honors that trust, nasan tayo? We're here. If 1 chooses to trust and player 2 betrays, then player 1 receives a -1 and player 2 receives a 2. This one. So now let's talk about a sub-game. A sub-game is a part of an entire game that can stand alone as a game itself. So it's a game within the game. Dynamic games can have sub-games. So an example here is the competition in the second period, which is a one-shot game within a larger 2-period game. So it's a piece of the original game that remains to be played beginning at any point at which the complete history of the game is common knowledge. So in the one-shot trust game, the history of the play is common knowledge after player 1 moves. The piece of the game that remains is just the one move by player 2. And for backward induction, we would rely on something called sub-game perfection. So we were looking at each of these sub-games, and basically means that if a strategy chosen at the start of the game is optimal, it must be optimal to stick with that strategy at every later juncture in the game as the game progresses. To be sub-game perfect, the player's strategies must first be a Nash and then must fulfill an additional requirement. The point of the additional requirement is to rule out Nash equilibria that rely on non-credible threats. Okay, so let's use all of these concepts to get the dynamic solution to this entry deterrence. So we solve it by working backward through the game tree. If player 2 gets to move, that is, if we reach this node because player 1 trusts, then 2 can receive a payoff of 1 by choosing to honor, or a payoff of 2 by choosing to betray. So player 2 will betray 1's trust. So that is highlighted here as the dark line. If you can see, this is slightly heavier than this line. So this means that player 2 will use this one. Knowing this, player 1's initial choice amounts to ending the relationship. So receiving a payoff of 0, or trusting player 2 and receiving a payoff of -1. So therefore, player 1 should not trust. So player 1 should not trust here. So that's why this one has a bolder line than this one. So this is a similar situation to this application here, which is a dynamic game of 2 software companies. MicroHard is the incumbent. Nouvel is the upstart who wishes to enter the market. So this is now a more straightforward entry deterrence game here. Nouvel stays out. Nouvel will earn a normal profit outside of profit is equal to 1. MicroHard earns a profit of 5. If Nouvel enters the market, and if MicroHard accommodates the entry, then each firm has a profit of 2. But if MicroHard fights, then there will be a profit of 0 for each firm. So this is similar to what we discussed earlier about yung model ni Stackelberg, wherein if Nouvel enters the market and if MicroHard fights and sets output equal to the perfectly competitive output, then each company will have 0 profit. For dynamic game, a firm's entry is a complete set of instructions that will tell the firm what actions to pick at each situation in the game. Okay, so this is the normal representation of this model, of this entry model. Okay. So remember, Nouvel is the entrant. He wants to decide whether he wants to enter or not. And MicroHard will want to decide what will happen, right? Depending on entry or exit, fight or accommodate. So now let's talk about the solution, right? The Nash equilibrium is defined in terms of strategies that are best responses to each other. In the second Nash equilibrium, stay out or fight, MicroHard never actually takes or implements a fighting action. Okay, because like stay out siya. And then this fight is not really a real fight, right? Relies on a threat to do so or a device to deter Nouvel from entering. Nash equilibrium is stay out fight, or Nash equilibrium stay out fight. Okay. A threat by MicroHard. I am going to price high as long as you stay out. But if you enter my market, I will cut my price and lower your profits to 0. So this threat suffers from that credibility problem. So once Nouvel has entered the market, taking action to fight here is not in MicroHard's best interest. It does better by accommodating. So Nouvel might not believe the threat in the first place. So in order for this to be a Nash equilibrium, the entrant, which is Nouvel, must believe the incumbent will fight. But once you get to that node, fighting to believe that he will fight if you go in is an incorrect assumption, because that is not a credible assumption by Nouvel. In other words, if Nouvel does something else, which is to enter, he will fight. Okay, MicroHard will fight. is not really a credible promise by Microhard. Because once Newell has entered, ayaw na niya mag-fight, he will prefer to accommodate. So the Nash equilibrium should be redefined so as to rule out such strategy combinations. Use of subgame perfection or subgame Nash equilibrium to redefine or refine the definition. So Nash equilibrium is subgame perfect only if at that point in the game when a player is called upon to make good on a promise or threat, doing exactly that and promising or fulfilling the promise or threat is what would be the player's best response. If any promise or threat, such as fighting, are made in one period, carrying them out is still part of Nash equilibrium in a later period should the occasion rise to do so. So if Microhard adopts a strategy, that includes, let me just erase this. If Microhard adopts a strategy that includes the threat of a fight if entry occurs, then if the strategy is subgame perfect, it must be optimal for Microhard to indeed fight when Newell enters. So what it's saying is that if stay out and fight, okay, is the equilibrium, okay, then that means if ever we reach this node here, then Microhard should fight. Pero hindi, right? Microhard will want to accommodate because 2 is greater than 0. So a strategy combination is subgame perfect if the strategy for each player is the best response against the strategies of the other players. For a game beginning at mode M2, the best response for Microhard is accommodate, not fight, because 2 is bigger than 1. Hence, the strategy combination of stay out and fight cannot correspond to a subgame perfect equilibrium. So our equilibrium here is to enter and accommodate. So backward induction technique solves for solving games with a finite number of nodes. And the simplest way to identify the subgame perfect equilibria is to work backwards, eliminating branches that will not be taken until we have reduced the game tree to having a single branch from each node. Okay, so in other words, this is in fact the Nash equilibrium, the dynamic backward induction Nash equilibrium here. Because an enter, a fight by Microhard is in fact not a dynamic Nash equilibrium. Okay. So in that case, so all we've learned is it's very difficult. So let me outline again what we've shown here, right? Is that entry is very difficult. Entry deterrence is difficult unless you commit, okay, to something that in the second stage here is an inferior position. Okay. And the rest of this lecture will basically delve on different ways in which that commitment can be done. Okay, how can an incumbent commit to fight in the future such that an entrant will believe it? Okay. So it involves making threats and implementing them in a way that's credible. Okay. So that's what is called in industrial organization as this predatory conduct or entry deterrence conduct. So you're employing actions or tactics that are only profitable if they deter rival firms from competing in the market, which allows them to have these credible threats. So to stop firms from entering the market. Okay, so now let's think about further ideas or concepts on entry. So there are 4 facts that are common in entry in dynamic industry models, right? First, entry is common. Entry occurs is usually small scale, right? So they start small and at some point they will grow. New entrant survival rates are low. And industries with high entry rates also have high exit rates. So here, the ability of early entrants to sustain in a dominant industry position also reflects deliberate behavior aimed at driving new entrants out or preventing their entry in the first place. So, true predation requires the actions taken by a firm are more profitable only if they drive existing rivals out of the market or deter potential rivals from coming in. It may seem that the predator's firm's profit are reduced and therefore irrational. Okay. Rationality, the additional profit that the predator earns if and only if the conduct is successful at limiting competition. Predatory pricing is an example of predatory conduct. So this is one of the actions that a firm can do to convince a firm not to enter. So here we define it as a firm setting an ultra low price that drives rival firms out of business. So if you limit the price, a low price at which potential rivals are deterred from entering the market in the first place, or you limit output when output is a strategic variable. So in this case, we will talk about a model of entry deterrence, okay, which is the only model of entry deterrence that we'll be using. So interestingly, what we've learned here is that entry deterrence is very hard to do because threats are usually not credible, right? But there are some models that allow for entry deterrence using capacity, and this is one of the models that we'll be talking about today, which is a model called the limit pricing theory, which uses price. So setting a low price such that potential rivals are deterred from entering the market in the first place.